When I took the job as a stand mechanic at Horizon Thrills, I thought fixing rides would be my biggest challenge. A busted track here, a rusted joint there, nothing I couldn't handle. It wasn't a dream job, sure, but it was honest work. The kind of gig you take to keep the bills paid, to make life manageable. But if I'd known what I was walking into, if someone had warned me about what that place really was, I would have run the other way. It started innocently enough. A handshake, some paperwork, and then I was led into the staff room. The place had the smell of old wood and grease, the kind of scent that clings to a theme park that's been around for far too long. There was nothing glamorous about it, just a rundown park with a few faded attractions, a handful of bored employees, and the promise of a paycheck every 2 weeks. It seemed so ordinary. Then they handed me the rule book. The manager, a wiry man with a nervous energy about him, slid it across the table like it was no big deal. I thought it'd be the usual, safety protocols, operating procedures, that sort of thing. But when I opened it, I saw it wasn't like any rule book I'd ever read. The rules were strange. No, not strange, specific, almost paranoid. Rules like, do not approach the carousel after midnight, even if it's playing music. If you see someone standing at the base of the Ferris wheel after hours, do not engage. Leave immediately. Never, under any circumstances, touch the clown statue in the funhouse. I remember raising an eyebrow, glancing up at the manager. I even laughed a little, assuming it was some kind of initiation prank. "What's this about?" I asked, but he didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. Instead, his face went pale, and he leaned in closer, lowering his voice as though he didn't want the walls to hear him. "Just follow the rules," he said, his tone flat and final. "Don't ask questions." It wasn't the words that got to me. It was the way he said them. Like he wasn't just reciting company policy. Like he needed me to understand how serious he was. I remember the way his hand trembled as he tapped the booklet, his knuckles white against the table. He looked me in the eye and added, "If you break them, well, let's just say you don't want to break them." At the time, I didn't think much of it. I shrugged it off as superstition, something cooked up to scare the new guy. But looking back now, I should have seen it for what it was, a warning. Because those rules weren't about keeping the ride safe. They weren't even about keeping the guests safe. They were about keeping something else in line. The first night passed uneventfully. I spent most of it wandering the park, familiarizing myself with the layout. The rides were old but functional. The staff was polite but distant, like they didn't want to get too close. I chalked it up to the late shift. Everyone's a little quieter when the world outside is asleep. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something they weren't telling me. By the second night, that feeling grew stronger. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just little things that didn't add up. A faint metallic smell near the funhouse that lingered long after I'd left, lights flickering in the distance, even though the power to the rides was off, footsteps echoing behind me when I knew I was the only one there. Then came the fourth night, the night that changed everything. I was working near the Ferris wheel, inspecting the control panel. The air felt heavy, charged somehow, like the calm before a storm. I remember thinking it was unusually quiet, even for after hours. That's when I heard it, a soft creak, like metal shifting under pressure. At first, I thought it was the wind. The park had its fair share of groans and squeaks, after all. But this was different, rhythmic, deliberate. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. The Ferris wheel was moving, slowly, almost lazily, its giant frame turning against the night sky. Its lights were off, but the wheel itself was spinning, creaking with every rotation. I froze, my brain scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. The power to the rides was off. I'd checked it myself. There was no reason, no way, it should have been moving. That's when I noticed the figure. It was standing at the base of the wheel, just outside the shadows. At first I thought it was another staff member, maybe security doing their rounds. But then I realized something was wrong. It wasn't moving, it just stood there, unnaturally still, its head tilted slightly to the side, like it was watching me. I called out, my voice shaking more than I care to admit, "Hey, who's there?" But it didn't respond, it didn't even flinch, and then it turned its head. I don't know how to describe what I saw. Its face, if you could call it that, was twisted, wrong somehow, and its eyes, they weren't human. They didn't blink, didn't shift, just locked onto me with this unrelenting stare. That was the moment I realized the rules weren't a joke. They were the only thing keeping me alive. I wasn't planning to end up in Virginia, let alone working at a theme park. Life has a way of veering off course when you least expect it. I was 26, fresh out of luck, and in desperate need of a steady paycheck. Fixing things was always my thing. I liked solving problems, putting broken things back together, probably because there was a part of me that felt broken too. A few months earlier, I'd packed up what little I had and left behind a town that held nothing for me but bad memories. I won't bore you with the details. Just know that when I drove past the Horizon Thrills job posting, I didn't think twice about pulling over. It wasn't glamorous, but I didn't need glamour. I needed work. And for a guy like me, the idea of spending my nights fixing rides seemed like a no-brainer. Horizon Thrills sat on the edge of a small town, surrounded by dense forest. The kind of forest where the trees press together so tightly that sunlight barely breaks through. The park itself had seen better days. You could tell by the faded paint on the signs, the cracks in the pavement, and the rides that groaned under years of wear and tear. Still, there was something oddly charming about it. It felt like stepping into a place frozen in time, where the laughter of children and the smell of popcorn lingered in the air long after the crowds had gone. But there was something else about the place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. A weight, like the air was thicker here, heavier. At first, I thought I was imagining it. That is, until I met the staff. Most of them were friendly enough, but there was an edge to their friendliness, like they were trying too hard to act normal. There was one woman, Melissa, I think her name was, who stopped me on my way to the staff room. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "You new here?" When I nodded, she just shook her head and muttered, "Good luck," before walking off like she didn't want to say more. That's when I started to feel it, that gnawing sense that I'd stepped into something much bigger than I realized. But I pushed it down. It was just nerves, I told myself. First day jitters. Then came the orientation. The manager, his name was Greg, was a wiry guy with darting eyes and a smile that never quite reached his face. He handed me a stack of forms to sign and ran through the usual spiel about safety protocols, clocking in and out, and keeping the rides in good shape. It was all routine until he slid the rule book across the table. "This," he said, tapping the cover, "is your Bible. Read it, follow it, and you'll be fine." I opened it, expecting a list of maintenance checklists or maybe emergency procedures. Instead, the first page hit me like a bucket of cold water. Rule number 1, do not approach the carousel after midnight, even if you hear music. Rule number 2, if the Ferris wheel starts moving on its own, do not attempt to stop it. Leave immediately. Rule 3, never, under any circumstances, touch the clown statue in the funhouse. I blinked at the page, half expecting Greg to burst out laughing and tell me it was some kind of initiation joke. But when I looked up, his face was dead serious. I couldn't help myself. I chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "What is this? Some kind of hazing?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just sighed, like he'd heard that question 100 times before. "Look," he said, leaning in closer, "I don't care what you think about the rules. You don't have to believe them. Just follow them." I wanted to push him on it, to ask him what kind of job came with rules like these. But something about the look in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't joking. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was afraid. That was the moment I realized Horizon Thrills wasn't just any theme park. It wasn't just a job. There was something else going on here. Something everyone seemed to know about, but no one wanted to talk about. And for the first time, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. The rest of my first day passed in a blur. I was introduced to the rides, rusted machines with names like the Cyclone and the Twister. Each one seemed to groan under the weight of its own history, like it was tired of being here. Then there was the funhouse, a warped building with peeling paint and a cracked mirror facade. It had an aura about it, like it didn't belong. And in the center of the funhouse, lit by a single flickering bulb, stood the clown statue. It was taller than I expected, its face frozen in a grin that was too wide, its eyes too lifelike. I felt a chill crawl up my spine just looking at it. Greg must have noticed, because he muttered, Don't stare too long, and remember rule number 3. I told myself it was just a statue, just paint and plaster, but even now, I swear it felt like it was watching me. The first night on the job felt like stepping into another world. Once the sun went down, the park transformed. The laughter, the music, the colors, all of it vanished with the last of the guests. What was left was silence. Not the peaceful kind either. This silence felt heavy, like the park was holding its breath, waiting for something. As I made my rounds, the only sounds were the occasional groan of a ride settling into itself and the soft crunch of gravel under my boots. The air felt different too, thicker, almost oppressive. I noticed it the most near the carousel. It wasn't plugged in, but I swear I could feel a faint vibration beneath my feet, like the ground itself was humming. The funhouse was worse. The closer I got to it, the colder the air seemed to become, and not in a normal nighttime chill kind of way. This was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, that made your breath feel like it was freezing in your lungs. I tried to ignore it, but something about that place, it felt alive. It didn't take long for things to start feeling off. I was walking past the carousel, flashlight in hand, when I saw the lights flicker. Just for a second. They blinked on, casting a warm, golden glow over the painted horses, before snapping back to darkness. I stopped dead in my tracks. The ride wasn't even connected to power. Greg had told me that himself. I stood there for a moment, shining my flashlight over the control panel, but everything was as it should be. No power, no explanation. I chalked it up to my imagination and moved on, but the feeling didn't leave me. It followed me as I made my way to the Ferris wheel. The ride loomed over the park, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the night sky. As I got closer, I thought I heard something. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and just a little too close for comfort. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. Just the wind stirring the leaves and the distant creak of metal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was around midnight when I heard it. I was near the funhouse, checking on a squeaky wheelbarrow someone had left behind, when the sound reached me. A laugh. Not a full-on belly laugh, but a soft, eerie chuckle that echoed from inside the funhouse. It stopped me in my tracks. I stared at the entrance, the faded clown face grinning back at me from above the door, and felt my stomach twist. No one was supposed to be in there. I told myself it was just the wind, some loose panel creaking in the right way to mimic laughter. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the funhouse until I was far enough to feel like I could breathe again. That's when I decided I'd finish my rounds quickly and head back to the staff room. Whatever was going on here, I didn't want to stick around to find out. It happened on my third night. I was walking past the funhouse, deliberately avoiding looking at the building, when something caught my eye. There, standing by the clown statue inside, was a figure. It wasn't moving, just standing there, completely still, half hidden in the shadows. For a moment, I thought it was a mannequin, or maybe another statue I hadn't noticed before. But something about its posture, its shape, felt wrong. I blinked, and it was gone. Just like that. 1 second it was there, the next, nothing. I told myself I was seeing things, that the stress and the lack of sleep were messing with my head, but that didn't make it any easier to shake the image from my mind. The weirdest thing happened during a routine inspection of the cyclone. I was crouched down, checking the brake mechanisms, when I heard it, my name. Soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. My stomach dropped. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the empty park and the sound of my own breathing. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, or maybe the creak of the ride itself, but the voice had been too clear, too deliberate. It wasn't my imagination. Someone, something, had whispered my name. That same night, I went back to the staff room to grab a cup of coffee and calm my nerves. As I leaned against the counter, I noticed something on the wall. At first, I thought it was graffiti, just some scribbles from a bored employee. But as I got closer, I realized it was a message, scrawled in thick, uneven letters. Don't break the rules, or it will come for you. The paint was dry, meaning it had been there for a while. But I'd been in that room every night, and I was certain it hadn't been there before. I stared at the words, my pulse racing. and felt a creeping sense of dread settle over me. Whoever, or whatever, had written that message wanted me to see it, and I had a feeling they weren't talking about the park manager. By the third night, I thought I was starting to adjust to the strangeness of the park. The whispers, the flickering lights, the unnerving cold. I told myself it was all just part of the atmosphere, like a bad dream you couldn't quite wake up from. But that night, I learned how wrong I was. The rules weren't just suggestions. They weren't there to scare me. They were there to protect me. It started near the carousel. I didn't mean to break the rules. I wasn't even thinking about them. I was finishing up my rounds, distracted by a loose railing I'd noticed earlier, when I realized the time. Midnight. I was standing no more than 10 feet from the carousel when I remembered rule number 1. Do not approach the carousel after midnight, even if you hear music. I froze. The ride was silent still, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put into words. The painted horses seemed different. Their positions had shifted, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their painted eyes glinting in the dim light. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the shadows. Then I saw it, one of the horses' heads slowly turning toward me. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking as I shone it on the carousel. Nothing moved. The horses were still, their painted grins mocking me. I tried to laugh it off, to tell myself I was imagining things. That's when the music started. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a chill racing down my spine. The carousel began to hum, its lights flickering on one by one. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there frozen, as the platform started to turn, the horses bobbing up and down like marionettes. The music grew louder, each note more twisted than the last. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The carousel went dark, the music cutting off mid-note. The horses were still again, their painted faces locked in their eternal smiles. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my heart pounding, the rulebook's warning echoing in my mind. Don't approach the carousel after midnight. I made it halfway through my rounds when I heard it, the unmistakable creak of the Ferris wheel. I stopped dead in my tracks, the flashlight beam trembling in my hands. The wheel was moving, slow and deliberate, the empty carriages swaying in the night air. Rule number 2 flashed through my mind. If the Ferris wheel starts moving on its own, do not attempt to stop it. Leave immediately. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and walk away, but something about the way the wheel turned, it felt wrong, like it was daring me to come closer. Against my better judgment, I approached, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. I climbed the steps to the control booth, my hands shaking as I shone my flashlight over the dials. Everything was off. No power, no explanation for why the ride was moving. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. On one of the carriages, near the edge where the paint was peeling, were marks. Deep, jagged claw marks, like something had raked its nails across the metal. My breath hitched. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold surface, and felt a sticky residue. Blood. Fresh. That was all it took. I bolted, my heart hammering in my chest as I stumbled down the steps. Whatever was happening in this park, it wasn't just in my head. It was real, and it was dangerous. I made it back to the funhouse on autopilot, my mind racing. The rules felt less like guidelines now, and more like a lifeline, the only thing keeping me safe. As I approached the funhouse, I glanced at the clown statue through the cracked mirror facade, expecting to see its familiar grin, but it wasn't there. I stopped, staring at the empty pedestal where the statue had always stood. I'd walked past it every night, that grotesque smile burned into my memory. Now it was gone. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight into the funhouse, half expecting to see it lurking in the shadows. But the place was empty, just warped mirrors and peeling paint. I backed away slowly, my pulse thundering in my ears. Somewhere deep in the funhouse, a sound echoed, a single, hollow laugh, faint but unmistakable. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. Whatever had taken the clown statue, whatever had left those claw marks on the Ferris wheel, it wasn't something I wanted to meet. By my 5th night, the fear had turned to something else. Curiosity, maybe, or desperation. The rules no longer felt like protection, they felt like chains. I couldn't stand it anymore, the not knowing. The laughter, the whispers, the moving rides, they were all pieces of a puzzle, and I needed to see the full picture. So I made a choice, a stupid, reckless choice. I decided to break the rules, on purpose. If the park wanted to show me what was hiding in its shadows, I was ready to see it. I started with the funhouse. Rule number 3, never, under any circumstances, touch the clown statue in the funhouse. But the statue was already gone, wasn't it? Whatever had taken it was inside that building, and I was going to find it. The moment I stepped inside, the air shifted. It was colder than I'd ever felt, like stepping into a freezer. My breath fogged in front of me as I shone my flashlight across the warped mirrors. The reflections twisted and stretched, making the room feel endless, like I could walk for hours and never reach the other side. At first, I thought I was alone, but as I moved deeper into the funhouse, I started seeing things, shadows flickering at the edges of the mirrors, tall, spindly shapes that didn't match my reflection. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the empty, peeling walls. Still, the shadows kept moving, darting from mirror to mirror, always just out of reach. I was halfway through the maze when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a shape behind me in the glass. But when I turned, the shadow didn't disappear. It grew. Slowly, it stepped out from the reflection, its body impossibly long, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its face was wrong. Too many eyes, too many mouths, stitched together like a grotesque puppet. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through me like a knife. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking as I tried to keep the beam steady. The thing tilted its head, its eyes darting across my face like it was studying me. Then it moved. It didn't walk, it glided, its feet barely touching the ground. I turned and ran, the sound of my own breathing deafening in my ears. Behind me, I could hear it following, its long limbs scraping against the walls, its laughter echoing through the mirrors. I didn't dare look back. I burst out of the funhouse, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. But the thing didn't stop. It followed, its grotesque form silhouetted against the moonlight. I ran past the carousel, its painted horses now frozen in grotesque snarls, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The music started again, that warped, haunting tune, but I didn't stop to listen. The Ferris wheel was the last place I wanted to go, but it was the only path left. The ride loomed over me, its skeletal frame creaking as the wind pushed the carriages. I could hear the thing gaining on me, its laughter growing louder, more distorted. My legs felt like lead, but I kept running, the rulebook's warnings flashing in my mind. I reached the control booth and scrambled inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled with the switches, desperate to power the ride. If I could get it moving, maybe, just maybe, it would slow the thing down. The lights flickered on, the wheel groaning to life, but the sound seemed to anger it. The laughter turned to a guttural growl, and I felt the door shake as it slammed against it. There was no time to think. The Ferris wheel was turning, its carriages swaying precariously as the engine groaned under the strain. I climbed onto the lowest carriage, my fingers gripping the cold metal as the wheel began to lift me into the air. Below, I could see the thing clawing at the booth, its limbs twisting and bending as it tried to follow. The wheel carried me higher, but the thing didn't stop. It climbed, its long arms reaching for the carriage. I looked down and saw its face, those too many eyes staring up at me, its mouth splitting open to reveal rows of jagged teeth. I didn't think, I just jumped. The forest broke my fall, the branches cutting into my arms and legs as I tumbled to the ground. I lay there, gasping for air, the sound of the Ferris wheel creaking in the distance. I waited, listening, but the thing didn't follow. The forest was silent, its trees towering above me like sentinels. For the first time that night, I felt safe. I never went back to Horizon Thrills. I didn't quit, I just left. Packed my things and drove until the park was nothing but a memory in my rearview mirror. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the music, that warped, haunting tune playing somewhere in the back of my mind. And I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't broken the rules? Or worse, if I had stayed to find out? I left Horizon Thrills that night. I didn't tell anyone, didn't grab my last paycheck. I just drove. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely keep the wheel steady. But I didn't stop until the park was nothing but a memory in my rearview mirror. I thought I'd escaped it. I thought I was free. The road away from the park was long and empty, surrounded by miles of dense forest. The headlights of my car barely cut through the oppressive darkness, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I tried to focus on the road, to steady my breathing, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Images of the thing, the way it moved, the sound of its voice, kept flashing behind my eyes. Every shadow on the road felt like it was following me. I told myself I wouldn't look back, but as I rounded the last curve, I couldn't help it. I glanced in the mirror just once, and there it was, the Ferris wheel, turning slowly against the dark sky. The park was shut down, the power off, but the wheel was still moving. The lights flickered weakly, like they were straining to stay on. And for a moment, I swear I saw something, a figure standing at the top watching me. I slammed on the gas and didn't stop until I was home. I thought leaving the park would be the end of it, but it wasn't. The first night I woke up to the sound of music, a soft, warped tune, just like the carousel. It was faint, coming from somewhere outside my window. I jumped out of bed, throwing open the curtains, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street, silent and still. The next night, it was worse. I dreamed I was back in the funhouse, the mirrors twisting and warping around me. The thing was there, its too many eyes watching me, its mouths whispering words I couldn't understand. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. But the worst part, the music was still playing. Faint, but unmistakable. I checked every room, but there was no source, no explanation. It stopped as soon as the sun came up. By the third night, I was starting to lose it. I barely slept, jumping at every sound. That's when I saw it, the clown. It started as a shadow, just a trick of the light in the corner of my room. But as I stared, it didn't move. It didn't disappear. Its shape became clearer, a painted grin, too wide and hollow, empty eyes. I blinked and it was gone, but I swear I could still feel it watching me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the lingering effects of the park. But deep down I knew the truth. I hadn't left Horizon Thrills behind. It had followed me. I decided to destroy the rulebook. Maybe it was stupid, but part of me thought that if I got rid of it, the park would leave me alone. I tossed it into the fireplace, watching as the pages curled and blackened in the flames. For a moment I felt relief, like I'd taken back some control. But then I heard it, the music, loud and clear, echoing through my house. I ran to the window, my chest tight, and there it was, the Ferris wheel. Standing in the middle of my street, its lights glowing faintly in the dark. I don't know how it was there, or how no one else seemed to notice. But I knew what it meant. The park wasn't done with me. I don't know what it wants, or why it chose me. But every night since I left, the music has followed me. Sometimes it's faint, just a distant echo in the back of my mind. Other times it's deafening, like it's coming from inside my own head. And then there's the clown. I see it everywhere now. In reflections, in shadows, in the corner of my eye, always watching, always waiting. I haven't slept in days. I'm afraid of what will happen if I close my eyes. But one thing's for sure, I'll never ignore the rules again. I only hope it's not too late. So that's my story. 5 nights as a stand mechanic at Horizon Thrills. 5 nights that changed my life, or maybe ended it. Honestly, I don't know anymore. Every day I feel like the shadows are a little closer, the music a little louder. I tell myself it's just paranoia, but deep down I know the truth. The rules weren't just rules, they were warnings, and I broke them. Now, I have to ask you, what would you have done? If you were in my shoes, alone in that park, would you have followed the rules? Or would your curiosity have gotten the better of you too? Have you ever heard of strange rules like these? Stories of places that seem wrong? Maybe you've worked a job with rules that didn't quite make sense. Or maybe you've broken a rule you shouldn't have and paid the price. If you have, I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments below. You never know, it might help someone else stay safe. And if you thought this story was chilling, trust me, there's more where it came from. This wasn't the first time I've heard of strange rules being more than they seemed, and it definitely won't be the last. So if you're ready for more stories you won't forget, or might wish you could, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You don't want to miss what's coming next. And one last thing, if you ever find yourself working somewhere with a rule book full of strange warnings, don't laugh them off, don't question them, just follow them. because sometimes the rules are the only thing keeping you alive.